First of all, I just want to kick it off by saying hello. My name is Mustafa, and I'm from the team at Plato, and we're hosting this webinar. And really, we host webinars in general so we can help engineering managers become better leaders. So today's really exciting. We have Asanka, who's a senior vice president of engineering at InVision, and he'll be sharing tips on how to be a better communicator. And again, at Plato, we host more webinars, so definitely join us for future events, future webinars. And then if you're looking for a mentor, that's what we do. We actually help engineering managers find a mentor so they can talk to someone who's experienced and talk to them about their management challenges. So feel free to visit us at platohq.com. So let's turn it over. We actually host these webinars oftentimes with our friends, and today we have our friends at LingoLive who'll be kind of running the first half of this webinar. So Rachel, she's on the product team over there. She'll be asking questions to Asanka, and then after that, we'll actually take questions. I'll take over, and we'll be asking questions, from the audience. So let's pass it on to Rachel.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So I'm with LingoLive, and I'm product manager here with us. And just a little bit about who we are. So we essentially service people leaders at fast-growing companies who want to support their emerging leaders' growth and development. And we focus primarily on skills-based coaching, so different from the mentorship model of Plato. And we really help employees gain the skills they need to contribute their unique potential in the workplace. And it helps improve team performance and bottom line results and things like that. So that's a little bit about us. And do you want me to go right into questions, or Asanka, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit as well?
Sure, I'll introduce myself. My name is Asanka Jayasuriya. I'm SVP of engineering here at InVision, based in Austin, Texas. We're a 100% distributed company, so communication is somewhat vital here, as we have no offices anywhere, and my team is pretty much all over the world, which makes communication a challenge and absolutely critical. I'm happy to be here to chat with you today, Rachel.
Awesome. Well, it just so happens that I'm also I say a self-classified nerd about communication, so totally excited to jump in here. So I think something that I always find really important is when talking about something to align on the definition of what we're talking about, even if it seems maybe obvious. I think we all have different lenses in which we view even the most obvious. So I'm wondering, Asanka, if you could start by telling us a little bit more about how you define a new manager versus maybe a seasoned manager.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to use something as crude as time, but the reality for me is like management is it's not a natural thing. There's no such thing as a natural manager. Management is very much a skill, and it's learned. It's very different than, say, being a good leader, which is a little bit different. Leadership is not about people management. It's you can be an IC and be a great leader, but there's just a lot of hard lessons you have to learn when you move into people management. And for me, typically 2 to 3 years is the period of time that people get those kind of core experiences. But it really is the core experiences that I look for. Like, have they done the unfortunate role of a leader of having to do hard performance conversations and go through that? Have they had to guide teams through a reorganization? Have they been part of projects that have failed and been part of that and had to deal with that? Like, the set of experiences that I like to say is like, once someone's gone through these, like, they're really have kind of built up that set of experiences that I think are vital to being a manager. Typically 2 to 3 years is kind of the time frame that I typically put on it, though.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I understand that you don't want to have to say time, because it does pigeonhole some folks into being new, even if they're great at what they do. And so I'm wondering if there are other, beyond the time element of being a new manager, what else are maybe key differences that you notice between someone who is that newer manager and someone who is more seasoned veteran?
Yeah, so one of the things you'll often see with newer managers is a sense of protectionism over their teams. And that's not to say that every manager isn't responsible for their team and doing what's right by them, but sometimes newer managers will do that to a fault. When something goes wrong, it couldn't be my team. My team's amazing. Everybody on my team's a rock star. There's absolutely no issues here. And they're not willing or able to dig into what might be deeper root cause issues with how their team works together or performance issues. That's one typical thing you'll see in folks who aren't there yet. And the other is really, that transition from being an individual contributor to a manager is like, can you find the balance between giving your team direction without telling them what to do, right? No one likes to be micromanaged, but at the same time, managers are accountable for the deliveries of their teams. And have they found that balance? Like for me, that was one of the hardest transitions moving from a principal engineer role to a manager. It was 12, 13 years ago now, was, you come in as a strong engineer and you have strong opinions about how things should be done. And you kind of realize pretty quickly that you're telling your teams how to do everything and no one's really having a good time. So that's one of the other transitions, like learning that balance, I think is really, really difficult for a new manager.
Yeah, that's really interesting to just, if I could dig into that a little bit more. Do you think, what do you think was kind of that wake up call for you of, oh, wait, I need to give that space for people to figure out on their own versus using my skills to do it all?
Yeah, I mean, I would say when I started as a manager, it didn't go super well to start for that reason. I was really lucky, though, to be working for a VP that had a lot of faith in me and had a strong relationship with it. And he really told me I was not doing well. Like, and again, this is, going back to my original point about management is learned, and you learn by reading, you learn by working with other great managers who teach you things. And he laid it out for me. He's like, you're doing and telling your teams all the things to do. And even in the cases when you're right, like long-term, that's going to come back to hurt you because you will not be able to scale. Because if you're not there to tell them what to do and you haven't built up the processes, the leaders within your team to be able to make those decisions, you're not going to be successful. It's like a successful manager gets to a spot where his team's so effective that he can take on more responsibility for the team, more responsibility for the business because his team's working well together.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like feedback was really important for you there.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool. And I also did some of my research on InVision too, and I noticed that feedback is a big part of your culture. So it sounds fitting that that's how it came to be. And so I'm wondering, kind of given that fact in your own experiences, what methods does InVision use to develop those new managers to grow into those like seasoned managers? I know everyone has their own style at LingoLive. Ours is we say we used to, but now we, or like I used to, but now I, and that kind of motivates us to grow into the but now. So yeah, just curious what you all do over there.
Yes, so we are still very much a relatively young company, and I think we're figuring a lot of this stuff out. We have a learning and development team that's start putting together training for, I would say, for managers in general, not specifically for technical managers. But the work that I'm focusing with my team on the engineering side to help is we didn't really have a solid definition of what it meant to be a manager. Like, what are the boundaries of how technical do you need to be? How accountable are you for technical decisions when you're in a management role? How accountable are you for delivery? And like, what is the mix? And so what I'm putting a lot of effort now in with my team is to get really, really clear about this is what the expectations that we have as a company for a manager, a senior manager, a director. And we're putting a lot of effort into that because one, that gives people a rubric and a mechanism to look at and have conversations with their manager about where they are meeting areas, where they need to work on things. So right now, that's the biggest focus. Our team does also offer a lot of, our L&D team, a lot of training around crucial conversations, negotiation, more general management techniques, how to do one-on-ones. And there's other vendors that we work with where we provide a lot of that training to the managers. But on the technical side, we're really doing a lot of work now to really firm up that technical management track.
Yeah, so you said something that's super interesting about how there's like the non-technical skills of negotiation and one-on-ones and things like that. And I think for those that are managers on the call or those that are aspiring to be managers, sometimes we forget the whole picture, and then it's not just technical skills, especially when it comes to management and being a leader. So I'm kind of curious to dig in there a little bit more. Do you think that people have common misconceptions about what it means to have effective communication as a leader?
Absolutely. I think one of the common misconceptions is like, if you're not able to stand up in front of a big room of people and confidently be a public speaker, like you can't be a manager or leader. And I don't think that's true at all. I think the other misconception is it's not just about like, hey, people understand what you're saying or they don't understand what you're saying, or you speak clearly or you write clearly. The communication aspect, to me, it really comes down to how well you're able to connect with the people that you're communicating to. And that has very little to do, I've found, with, the specifics of, the words you're using. Some people say, oh, if English is a second language, then that's an impediment. But again, I don't think that affects your ability to connect with people. What has typically worked for me is trying to be as transparent and honest as I'm able to be in all the communications with folks. Now, when you're in senior leadership positions, obviously there's things that you often just can't tell people, right? Because there are things that are confidential. And I'm pretty clear about that too. Like, not just something I can't say, but for me, the criticality is really about the transparency and the authenticity in your communication. Because if people know that you are doing your best to be authentic with them and give them all the true information, the hard feedback, they value that communication a lot more than glossing over the hard issues and not providing real feedback.
Yeah, I think that brings up a great point. And one of the things that to bounce off that I've seen too is vulnerability. I think is a big part of what you're saying, right? With is vulnerability showing weakness, or is vulnerability leaning in and saying it's a strength to ask for advice, learn from mistakes, commit to growing versus staying.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest challenges, particularly as you get to be more senior in a management career, is people become less, until they really get to know you as a leader and the type of leader you are, they become less willing to give you, hey, like, that was a stupid idea. I didn't like that for the following reasons. And like, for me, that's the thing that terrifies me as a leader is you have a team of people who should all be much better than you at the specific things that they're doing. And they should know much more about those things. And I can help guide decisions and help, make decisions when I have to, but I want a team around me that's going to be like, no, we can't do that because this is dumb because of X, right? Like, we shouldn't do that. And you do have to make yourself vulnerable, make it clear to the team that you are willing to receive like that. You're willing to be challenged in front of the teams, and creating that environment is really, really important for a leader.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing that we're seeing in the industry is the notion of managing up, and how important it is for people to understand that that's something that is acceptable and something that, of course, done tactfully is really crucial to the managers and the company as a whole. And so I think that's, you bring up a great point there, because I do find that people often have a harder time when the higher up you get, feeling like you have that network to be able to give you criticism. So I think that's cool.
I think one of the traps that newer managers fall into is feeling like they always have to be right and they always have to be super authoritative. And like, if they show doubt or uncertainty or they don't know what to do, their team's going to lose trust in them. But I've always found the opposite to be true, which is if you have that attitude, very quickly you will lose the confidence of your team if they don't believe that you are authentic and they think that you know everything. Being honest about what you don't know is one of the best ways, I think, to get the trust of your team.
Yeah, I will. I love that. I will never forget one of my first jobs. They said, if you don't know, always say, I don't know. If you make it up, it will bite you later on. So I think that's definitely super valid.
And that is definitely a huge mistake that I think especially leaders can make when they're communicating up to senior leadership and you're in a meeting and a senior leader asks you a question as a manager about your team and you don't have the answer. You have that natural impulse to try and say something. And I have worked in other, in the environments, Amazon in particular, where like trying to make something up on the spot is not a good recipe for success for your career. You have to, but people will recognize, like, you know what, I don't know. I will be back tomorrow with an answer to that. Is a much better answer than trying to improvise something you don't.
Yeah, we have a core value of under promise and over deliver. And I think that falls into that perfectly of don't say, yes, this is how we, this is this answer, because then you're totally over promising and could potentially under deliver if your information was wrong. So yeah. And I'm just curious, like, how much do you think imposter syndrome plays into all the things we're kind of talking about right now?
Oh, I mean, all the time. Particularly that aspect of feeling like you have to seem like you know everything all the time. every stage of my career, you always kind of feel like, okay, I'm going to get to this level at some point where I feel like, yes, I know all the answers to all the problems and stuff like that, but you never really do. You're always, if you're actively pursuing your career, you should always be putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, taking new challenges, moving into things you don't know. And as a result, yeah, that's very much an issue. Mike Cannon-Brookes, the CEO of Atlassian, he did an amazing TED Talk on imposter syndrome, which I'd highly recommend for anyone. Like, there's a guy who built a multi-billion-dollar company, and to hear him talk about it was just amazing. Like, yeah, despite that, like every day feeling like, am I qualified to do this thing? Can I make this happen? I think that's true for leaders at every level.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it is true for leaders. And that's why I really liked it at the beginning when you explained how a manager isn't necessarily they're not, leader and manager are not always the same. You have to develop into a manager, even if you're a natural born leader. And I think, that's super important to keep top of mind. And so to kind of bring it back a little bit more to communication, especially as a product manager, and I'm very close with our engineering team. And so communication is like, I think all I do, but it's also all, we do so much of it all the time. And when I first came into product, I didn't realize, I don't think people explain to you how crucial communication is to managing not only people, but projects and work. And it's been interesting to go through that journey and see what some of those most critical challenges are that you need to overcome as a team or as a manager in terms of effectively communicating. So I'm kind of curious for you, when it comes to being a manager and having risen through the ranks of different levels of managerial work, what are some of those communication kind of specifics that you've noticed have been maybe either a trend or have come up time and time again, of things where you're like, man, once we fine tune this, or if we can get this right, like things become a lot better and easier. And I do know that y'all are remote, and so that probably is top of mind a lot.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in having organizations be as transparent with information as they can. I'm a big believer in having a single open place where you have documentation and ideas and ideation. And that's just a push that I've been making a lot in my career, because I just find it drives a lot of collaboration. Getting people to write things down is, and I know it sounds simple, but it is such a powerful tool. And if you can get to an organization where people are brainstorming ideas and they throw them on a wiki page and go back and forth, and that's persisted, it creates a very different environment. It's easier for people to start to understand what's happening in a team. It's easier for us as a leader to kind of browse around and get a sense for what's going on. So it's always feels like, documentation and writing things down is something that gets left by the wayside, but especially as teams become more distributed. And I haven't talked to an engineering leader in a while who isn't either thinking about adding remote or distributed to their teams, or going fully distributed, or considering it, because there's no choice. And that culture around written communication is a big part of it. Yeah.
That's funny, because I was thinking about this question, the thing I wrote down, I was like, how would I answer this? And I wrote down writing skills, actually, because I think that, and I'm curious to hear if this resonates with you, but I think the big thing is, okay, we can all write, but how you organize your thoughts, the way, and using inclusive language of not using acronyms for everything, and not using scalability, but not explaining what that means. And so the way you write, how you organize it, understanding how your audience is going to read it and take it. And I've also heard from my own engineers, they'll say stuff sometimes, and as a product manager, I'm like, that's engineering speak. I don't know what you guys are talking about. And they'll be like, yeah, the secret is we don't know what they're saying either. And so we're going to have to ask a million questions to figure it out. So I think writing is definitely something I've heard about. And so just kind of wondering if any of those examples resonate with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Writing is, and everyone has their different style, right? I tend to, for me, the majority of my writing these days is two forms: just broad communications to teams, or more tactical plan and documents. For broad communications to the team, I try and write so that it comes very much across like a narrative, me actually talking to people. They tend to be very informal. I use y'all, and living in Texas, I get to do that. and trying to make my communications very informal because I want them to come across like they can hear my voice and I'm actually just talking to them as much as possible. So that is, but everyone has a different style, right? And I think one of the things, again, where some people, not writing is not everyone's strength for sure, but I truly believe that everyone can be an effective writer with just a little bit of practice. And I think it's highly worthwhile for anyone who wants to go into a management career long-term to develop that competency.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other leaders, other executives, when they see something that's well written and well constructed, even an email, like it helps set the bars to like who I'm dealing with on the other end of this conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's tough for remote culture too, because if you're not seeing each other in person, or if you're not doing calls all the time, and if you're not doing video calls, then that how you write, your tone in writing is super important. And so I know I keep like drilling into certain things, that I'm wondering how you kind of finesse that ability for you to really bring your persona out in your communication if it wasn't necessarily verbal.
That is a good question. I mean, what I would say is I tend to write something, leave, come back to it, write something, come back, leave, come back to it. I don't have a good answer. It's just a style that I've developed over years. I like writing, to be honest. I find it helps me really solidify my thoughts. There have been times when I have had to write, what I thought was a great idea. And then I went to go about and write a document to validate and explain this great idea. And then by the time I finished writing the document, I kind of realized it's actually a terrible idea. And it's a great exercise because it forces you to construct your thoughts and your supporting evidence and build that narrative in a way that a PowerPoint presentation or other things doesn't. And it's actually one of the major reasons for the legendary Amazon 6-page documents and no PowerPoints. It just forces this thought process. And I find it actually very helpful to me to write, just to actually validate whether something I'm thinking even makes sense. And sometimes I will write entire things and then they never see the light of day, say in a private draft, and that'll be it, because I was like, that wasn't that as good an idea as I thought it was.
Yeah, and there's a lot of power in that, right? Being like, well, that's okay. That one's, glad that it was out and I don't have to worry about it anymore. So that's great. I think that the documentation and finding your own style of how to clear those thoughts and validate them is awesome. And I have one last question, but just quickly to say, I was thinking about this as you were answering one of my previous questions about like the difference between maybe a manager who's more seasoned versus newer. And I think when I think of that like kind of slowness, deliberate, conscious movement versus falling into like the culture of busyness that's so prominent now. And so I think like that example is, I'm like, yeah, actually that's what I imagine those higher level managers to be doing, is to be taking that time to be wrong or just figure it out. So that's great.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest tips for new managers is you always get thrown so much and you want to do all the things. As you get more senior, the thing you realize is the most important thing is not doing a lot of things and saying no to a lot so that you can focus on the most important things for your team. That's one of the things I often see with new managers. They just stretch themselves so thin because they're trying to support their teams. They want to support every request coming into their teams. And when you get that stretch that thin, it becomes very, very difficult to scale yourself.
Yeah, actually Basecamp has a great book it's called Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work. And
yes, that's a great book.
Yeah, such a good book. And one of their things is like, everyone just wants everything now. And so like you have to find ways to discourage people because they could probably find it on their own. Like you're saying, InVision has all this documentation everywhere, but I guarantee there's someone being like, hey, where's this document, when they could just spend an extra 5-10 minutes finding it themselves. And for me, that was a huge takeaway from reading that book, is like, it's okay to say no or just not answer for a little while because they'll probably delete that message later and think you didn't see it. And so, okay, so I know we only have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure, I just want to get my last question out there. We've talked a lot about like managers from your perspective, as well as your own experience being a manager. And so I'm kind of curious, and I think we've already talked about little components of it, but what keeps you grounded in being being a manager as you've gone through the, the turmoil to get to where you are now. Maybe turmoil is not the right word. But.
In terms of staying grounded, I think the thing that I've found is the weight of the responsibility does that for you, right? I mean, when you have a team of 5 to 6 engineers, you're responsible for them and their careers. When you have a team of, over 200, like I do now, like, that weight, it rests pretty heavy, right? Like, I know that decisions I make affect people's careers. It affects their livelihood, their families, and that can't help but ground you, I don't think. I mean, for me personally, because I know that mistakes that I make, and I will make them as much as I don't want to, really have the blast radius of those is so much higher. And that really forces me to take time, and a lot of time when I'm making those types of decisions. I think that's what keeps a good manager, good leader grounded, is knowing that the things you do now just affect a lot of other people. Even your mood, how you show up when you're having a bad day. You don't get to do that as much as you get a senior leader, because your whole team feeds off that. And it's stuff like that that keeps me grounded. Just knowing that the broader impact that my decisions make, or just my attitude around things. And you're much more, I am helping a 200-person team do amazing things, right? So that's the challenge for me, to make sure that I'm putting them in the best position possible to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a ripple effect, even if you're not talking to all 200 of those people, because the way, like, who manages them, the scale can kind of keep going. But I think, it ripples, that it goes through all those different tiers. And so it's super important, you're right, to be aware of how you show up every day, and how even the slightest of things makes an effect that you might not be aware of. And we didn't get to chat about this much, but I think emotional intelligence is such a big part of it too. And growing and developing that is, there's a lot of research now that's coming out about, like, how highly correlated those things are, of, like, being a successful manager and improving your EQ, which you can actually strengthen and improve, whereas, like, your IQ is kind of just there. And so a lot of these things we're talking about all relate to it, but I'm like, probably a good thing we didn't talk about it, because I could just, like, go off for an hour and a half. We don't have that, so I'll not go down that hole. But I think that's definitely something that we're kind of skirting around right now. So cool. Well, I think that I've used all of my question asking time. So thank you, Asanka, for kind of letting me poke into some of your responses.
It was great talking.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely want to say thanks to Rachel from LingoLive for asking the first set of questions. And then Asanka, if you love to ask you some questions that the audience has just submitted. So let's kick it off. So Chris from I guess she didn't mention his location, but Chris Whitechurch is his last name. So Chris is asking, so relationship building is critical to growing and guiding a successful team. So what techniques do you use to establish trust, building meaningful relationships with your team that would otherwise exist in a local office setting?
That's a great question. And actually, that was probably the hardest challenge for me joining InVision. I'd managed partially remote teams before with Trello at Atlassian, but being in this fully distributed environment, it was hard to build trust. A lot of the things that I had previously done, walk around management, different techniques, going out for beers, going out for lunches, like, that stuff's all taken away, right? Like, that's not an option. So I really struggled over my first 3 to 6 months to, like, be the leader that I want to be and build those relationships with my team. And then I kind of realized I just had to amp up my communication, like 10x what I normally did, like increase the writing volume of writing, increase my participation on Slack, have more one-on-ones with deeper into the organizations than I had before. And it really was around communication, using one-on-ones to talk about people's hobbies and interests, and, like, try and create these interactions where you get to really know people. But it's hard. It is the single hardest challenge, I think, for distributed teams. Is, human beings are social creatures, and are over the hundreds of thousands of years we've existed, we've built relationships by being in close proximity to people, and this this is new, right? And I think everyone's still figuring this out, and it's going to be a while before we really get used to it.
Yeah, I hear you. Yes. And also one other thing to mention to the listeners, feel free to upvote questions. If you see something that's really interesting, we'd love to get some signal on what's sort of valuable to you out there. So Barry Peterson's asking, there's a lot of emphasis on writing, as you mentioned, Asanka, but how do you, do you have any recommendations around driving a culture of reading? So, people document a lot that is often missed. So simply referring folks to documentation over and over can sometimes be kind of dismissive or even, passive aggressive. So what do you sort of recommend to encourage people to actually read?
That is a fantastic question. I don't actually have a good answer to that one, because that is a challenge I've always faced. I think the whole passive aggressive thing can really be addressed in the how, right? If someone says like, hey, how do you do this? And you just drop a link in response to someone you don't know, like that can easily have that thing. But like just adding some softer context around the communication can often really help. It's like, hey, why don't you take a look at this? I think this might answer your question. If it doesn't, just like hit me back up. Like that can address a lot of the passive aggressive kind of feels of saying, hey, can you, just read the document? I found the other thing too is once you actually have your whole team centralized around something and people just get used to searching that thing, it makes a big difference. But that is just a culture shift of getting more. I found the higher quality, the more content in that source of truth, the more often people will be likely to go there and look. And I think the single source is important because quite often teams have multiple places they document things. This is in a Google Doc, this is in paper, this is in Confluence, this is on some random wiki, we pin this note in Slack. It's like, that's when it gets really hard. I think a single source of truth for where you keep things is really important.
Awesome. And then kind of moving along to the next couple of questions. Let's see. And this is from an anonymous, so they didn't submit their name, but what are techniques that you use for giving feedback that will make a difference and actually, but still keep the person motivated? So how do you sort of give feedback, but then still keep their kind of morale high or keep them motivated?
That's a fantastic question. I think one of the traps that managers can fall into is it's called the shit sandwich. It's here's some really positive feedback. Here's the bad thing I wanted to say, and then here's some more positive feedback at the end to balance it out. That's like something I don't recommend doing. If it's an individual that you think has high potential and you're truly trying to motivate them, giving them the honest feedback about what they did wrong, what they need to improve, and as long as that comes from a place of trying to help them improve and you make that's clear, so the goal of this feedback is not just to tell you you're doing a terrible job. The goal of this feedback is to say I want to get you here from the spot that you're at, and we're going to work on getting there together, I think is the key. I think when people understand that the feedback is coming from a place of improvement and a place of we want to help you get better, it's typically received much, much better. And a lot of that comes down to the design and presentation of how you give that feedback to make sure that the focus is truly on improvement and truly on these are the things I really want you to work on.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think the quote unquote, shit sandwich technique it's very kind of ubiquitous. It's very common among managers. So it's great to hear just sort of a slightly different approach, so that's great thanks for sharing that. And then maybe one other time check. So it's about 6 minutes past the hour. Asanka, keep me posted on how, sort of soon you need to go. But maybe we'll go for another 20 or so minutes. And then a question from Garesh Rao. So this got upvoted by a couple of votes. So how do you improve verbal communication is the question. And obviously you mentioned a few techniques, just generally being transparent, it's all about kind of, your authenticity and being genuine, but any other tips around improving verbal communication?
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky enough that it's just something that's always been natural to me, but I've had to manage other individuals who really kind of struggled. One thing that I've often suggested to people is Toastmasters. If there's a local Toastmasters chapter near you, even though it is about public speaking, it still really gets you comfortable talking. And I've seen really, really strong progress from folks I've known who have joined that and just gotten so much more comfortable. Debate clubs are another great way to get better at that. And I guess I'm assuming the intent of the question is just how do you get better talking and addressing. those are both techniques that I have recommended to people that have been pretty effective. It just takes practice. Like for some people, some things come natural like that, and others it takes practice.
Great. And then the next question, so from Han Yin, who's also got a couple of upvotes. How much space should you give sort of a team around creative thinking? So even if they're on the wrong path, how do you sort of encourage creative thinking, which sometimes goes, kind of in the right direction, sometimes in the wrong direction? What's the right way of approaching that as a manager?
And I think this is the ultimate responsibility of a manager, right? Because you do want to give your team license to experiment. And you have to think about all the times you learned something by doing something wrong yourself, and how much more valuable it is to know that that thing was wrong because you had that experience rather than someone told you. The responsibility of the manager is to know the impact of that thing being wrong. And what I mean is, if your team's going to go off and do something and you're 99% sure it's not going to work out, and the impact is going to be they're going to burn a week, maybe that's not the end of the world. Let them do it. Let them go figure it out. Let them learn it. But if your team is going to do something and it's going to have a material impact to the business or to a critical timeline, and you know it, that's when it's your responsibility as a manager to provide that guidance. But it is really that balance of knowing, like, you're responsible for your team's success. So letting them do something which would drastically affect their true ability to succeed would not be good. But at the same time, there are smaller battles where they can go learn something themselves. Let them go do it. But it's not a black or white answer. It's more like you really just have to know the impact of that thing being wrong. Mm-hmm. And if that's tolerable to you and worth them learning, then absolutely let them do it.
Got it. Awesome. So thanks for sharing that. And then Christopher Whitechurch has another question. So there's a bit of sort of context, so I'll read the whole thing. So Chris asks, so effective remote culture communication is critical, as everyone knows. And Chris said that he's seen kind of a risk of communication overload. So maybe 90% of the communication happens over Slack or in maybe Docs. Effective, well-written communication takes time, and it's harder to self-correct than having maybe an organic, conversation in person. So the question is, do you have a suggestion that you've seen where you have effective and efficient communication while trying to also provide or be an open pool of communications or an open pool of ideas and transparency? So how do you be efficient while also being open, I guess?
I think the one thing I always say is that Slack is not a collaboration tool. It just replaces conversations. And I think too often we rely on the things in Slack being like a persistent source of knowledge. But the reality is, at least for me, once something scrolls away in Slack, like I never come back from 3 days away and scroll back through all my Slack channels to see what has gone on. Like it's not scalable. And in terms of the investment in writing, that's the thing that I actually really push on my teams to, like, if you're just brainstorming or have ideas, don't worry about writing the perfect document, right? Like once we get into that culture of just writing things down, at InVision, we have this term called bad version, which is like, here's just a thing I did and we threw some ideas. The grammar might be off, whatever, it doesn't matter. But it's like, as long as you get the sense of it, like my communications tend to be a little bit differently when I'm communicating to the entire team, and it has to be more polished. But for general communications, even when I'm brainstorming and throwing something on a wiki page, I don't invest a lot of time in the writing being perfect. And I think this is one of the things is like, just because we write something down, it doesn't mean it has to be super polished. And I try and really push that on my teams. It's like, just get stuff down. It helps. It helps for you. It helps for your teammates to understand. No one's gonna, once you get into that culture, people aren't gonna be like, oh, this doc doesn't look great. His tables are off and doesn't match and doesn't have the right structure. Like, I really try and push them to get stuff down quickly and iterate on it.
I love the idea of sort of a bad version, where people can feel free to just put something out there without being judged. They're able to be vulnerable and open and communicative without without worrying about how people would judge them. So that's interesting. Let's see, got a lot of questions. Many of them are on remote teams, so let's touch on that. So Robin Sturmite asked, so remote teams can span the whole globe. So what do you do to make sure that everyone, regardless of their time zone, gets a fair chance to connect to you, I guess, in equal kind of measure?
So that is different. So fortunately, at least at InVision, we have some degree of time zone overlap for almost the entire engineering department. I think there's at least 2.5 hours where we have almost 100% overlap across our Europe and South America, Central America, North America, where we're largely co-located. So we're largely located. So, we make sure to schedule all hands during those times, my office hours during those times. So we try and make sure that anything that everyone needs to hear happens during that period of overlap. I think once you get to the world where you have no overlap, and I have been on teams like that before, it gets really hard. At Atlassian, we had my team here in Austin and teams in Sydney, like almost no overlap between our days. As an Amazon, my teams in Toronto, and there were teams also in China that we worked with. It becomes hard. It becomes very difficult on the teams involved because people are having to change their personal lives to attend meetings and things like that. And generally speaking, I tell teams to avoid collaboration, setting up situations where you have to do frequent collaboration across non-overlapping time zones, because there's a significant tax on the people involved. And wherever possible, I think it's best to try and avoid that.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Awesome. And then, so kind of moving back to maybe documentation. So Hanyan asks, so what if your team is not exactly on board with documenting the work they produce? How do you encourage them, considering that in many organizations, there's kind of more value, or you get rewarded for maybe writing good code rather than writing good documentation. So, how do you, obviously you can't force them, per se, but how do you just sort of make sure that they are doing it, even if they're not enjoying it? How do you make sure that they're actually documenting? How do you sort of approach that?
Well, I guess the thing I would challenge is, I think you can force it, right? As a leader, when you set up the culture of like, this is just how our team works, and this is, if it's truly important to the team, it's truly you want to be part of the culture, you can. Because by the same token, someone can say like, I don't believe in code reviews. I think I should just push my stuff straight to production all the time, right? Like it's different perspectives like that, that if you make it part of the culture of the team and part of your rituals, it's like one of the rituals we have is we document things to the best of our ability and we carve out time. People aren't expected to do that. I think you have to do that. It's like, again, it's not so much forcing people, but it's just teams set up rituals and they set up practices for how they operate, right? We do our daily stand-up at this time. It's like, well, I don't believe in stand-ups, or I don't want to do that. Like, can you force that? I think you can, as a leader, say like, these are the norms of our team. This is what's important to us as a team, as a company. Like, I think that is totally fine to set those kinds of norms up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then with the way, with the documentation, how do you actually organize the documentation? So is it by maybe department or by kind of domain or topic areas? Like, how do you sort of, how do you sort of organize the documentation, just because people have different preferences when it comes to kind of knowledge management, if you will?
Yeah. So there's two different general schools of thoughts on this. Like, some people are really focused on like the information architecture of how this stuff is stored, like department thing, and sort all that out, make it perfect. I've kind of got this stage in my career where it's like, I found that is like almost too much work most of the time. And if wherever you put stuff has a really good search function, I want to take people cognitive load from people away of like, where should I put this? And like being worried about like where the thing that they want to write should go, as opposed to just being able to write things and put things in quickly. In my ideal world, we would have a documentation system where you just write things up, and through tags and auto classification, that stuff just all gets sorted out behind the scenes. So you don't have to worry about that. So what I push on my team is just get it in there somewhere. We have a reasonable enough search. We, write keywords, write relevance, you'll find it. But again, that's just my opinion. Other people's are much more in favor of having like a strong information architecture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And then moving back to the question about remote, sorry that we're kind of jumping around, but this is from Marco, and it's actually a bit of a more general question, but what are some strong techniques when it comes to, or what are some techniques you've used to scale distributed teams? So it's a very general question, but I don't know if you want to give a couple of tips, I guess.
Yeah. So I mean, the communication and writing things down is definitely a big one. Like, it is a core part of like I can't emphasize that enough as to how important that is. Transparency is, again, the other one that is really, really big, because people aren't around each other. It makes making, transparency so much more important, that people feel connected, that they can feel like there's authentic communication coming from their teams. One of the other things we do to kind of scale is really try and, wherever possible, because budget is always a consideration, right? Is try and get people together in groups so they can, once in a year go grab a beer with the folks on their team or have lunch or a meal. Like, those are some of the techniques. But again, I still do lean heavily on like communication, increasing the frequency of writing things down, getting out of Slack as quickly as possible and going to Zoom. Like, we can tend to get into these Slack rat holes where you're going back and forth with someone for like 20 minutes. Or like, why don't we just Zoom and just like talk this out? And then we actually have a face-to-face interaction. It's another technique, pushing people to use Zoom much more than Slack.
Great. And then Ivan Kronenko, he's asking, what does the ladder of growing one's effective communication skills look like? So what's kind of maybe the first couple of things to kind of get into good shape? Is it maybe strong writing, concise writing? So what's sort of maybe the first couple of steps to, to becoming a great communicator?
That's a good question. I guess I hope to learn as I become a better communicator. I think a lot of these things can be worked on in parallel because they're such different skills. Like, your written skills are so different than verbal skills. I don't really have a lot of great strategies, like in general, in terms of the ordering that you would focus on. But I think you should pick the ones. For me, I lean into my strengths a lot, which is writing for me personally. So I will focus on that. And that's something I also encourage people to do, is like, there are areas that you want to get better, but pick the one that you're best at and focus on getting really, really good at that one first. Because like, we always want to get better, especially people who believe in self-improvement, want to just get better at their careers. Well, pick the areas where they're the weakest first, and you definitely want to invest time in that. But I've often found like picking the areas that you're strong at and becoming amazing at is a better way to go to.
Okay, great. And then it's 20 minutes past the hour. I think, Asanka, keep me posted on when you're ready for like that last question.
Maybe just another couple questions.
Yeah, perfect. So Marco's asking, how do you ask for feedback? So as a manager, how do you make sure that you get feedback, and how do you encourage your reports to actually give you feedback? How do you make sure that they're not scared or worried or concerned about offering you that?
I ask for it, and with a new team, that's difficult. They're less likely to give that. So one of the things that I did at InVision joining here is have my HR business partner facilitate sessions where she collects feedback from the team anonymously, and we meet. They call the simulation sessions, and like, she gives me the readouts from the team, and it's a safer environment. And I actually did that again where a few months ago, the HR leader went to the team, collected a bunch of feedback from me, and had a good discussion with the team. It's a helpful technique, but I've started to notice over the past year that they're much more willing to give me feedback directly. So I think that takes time to build that trust, but in the interim, a safe way to give that feedback through someone like a trusted HR business partner, or someone that can be that aggregator of information and run a session like that is super useful.
Cool. Awesome. That's a helpful tip. And then a couple more questions. Let's see. So how do you, I guess you touched on this a little bit, maybe if there's any specifics, I think the audience would love to hear. Are there specific processes or just areas that, for a new manager who's like kind of defining what to write down, is there anything specifically, is there sort of a process around how you talk to a new manager about documenting things? Is there kind of key things that they should be documenting initially, or?
I guess from the perspective of their team, I think the question is when you onboard new people to your team and when people leave, how much effort is that for you and the other people on your team to tell them everything and explain everything? And if the answer to that is a lot and it's high, because let's be honest, in our industry today, people move around a lot, right? Because it's a growing industry. There's lots of opportunities, people move, and your ability to have a team that can absorb new people quickly and bring them up to speed is a huge asset to you as a manager. And so when you look at that and you look at your onboarding and how quickly it takes people to become productive, that's where I would invest in how do you make that as fast as possible? What parts of your documentation are missing that make that slow? Is setting up your dev environment not documented at all and someone spends a whole week setting up their dev environment? Is it the understanding the architecture of your old cranky, monolith service that's not written down everywhere and it's all tribal knowledge, that like figuring out the spots that really slow people down in onboarding would be the first thing that I would tackle.
Great. Awesome. Good to know. And then a couple last questions. Let's see. Justin Hart is asking, so do you have any tips on, how do you maintain, how do you be a better technical leader as a remote member, whether the team is also distributed or maybe the team is in office? How do you just maintain your kind of technical skills as a manager?
Let me see. Can you repeat that question? I thought I saw a different question from Justin Hart. I might have gotten confused.
Oh yeah, Justin, I guess I'll read it. So are there tips and maybe let me know if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, but are there tips and techniques to being a better technical leader as a remote member of an in-office team? Yeah.
Got it. So I think that's an anti-pattern 100%. And the reason why is until you shift a significant chunk of your team remote, all the little rituals that make it so crucial for that person to know what's happening tend not to happen. Like if everyone is standing up and talking over their cube walls about what's going on and making a quick decision and they're not in Slack or they're not on Zoom or they didn't write it down, it's really, really hard to be included unless you are incredibly aggressive and pushy about getting included in things. So I do consider that an anti-pattern. I think a big chunk of the team has to be distributed to force everyone to do the little things to keep people included. I would generally try and avoid like having a big co-located team with one or two people who happen to be remote.
Good to know. And then maybe two or three more questions. This has got a couple of upvotes. So do you think managers are effective if they manage only a front-end team, or have you seen managers be more effective when they manage a team that is part of a project? Maybe they're managing back-end teams, front-end devs. Do you have any sort of perspective on that?
Yeah, so this is going to be an opinion that I think you're going to find a wide array of differing opinions from engineering leaders. I'm a big believer in teams not being aligned around technology and being aligned around business value. And there's a couple reasons for that. It's better for a team to own the entire journey and the entire success of something than just, hey, I built the front end. I don't know why it's slow. It must be something with the back end service. Or like, I don't know why users are having a terrible experience. My service's P99 is off the charts. Must be something with the front end. I don't love that model personally. The other part of it is, as a leader who's developing, to become a well-rounded leader, I think you want to understand how to build software, period, right? Like, I don't know that there is ever going to be, if you think of a career track, if you start up like, I'm going to be a front-end manager and I want to progress in management. Well, there's no, VP or CTO of front-end engineering, right? Like it doesn't go that way. Like you need to know how to manage all types of developers and on projects that encompass everything. So I'd encourage, even if you're coming from a front-end background or a back-end background and you move to management, you want to learn about the things that you haven't managed yet and the technologies that you don't know yet.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. Cool. Thanks for sharing your perspective, your opinion on that. And then maybe one or two last questions. Let's see. I saw one. Let's see if I can find this one. It's actually interesting. If you're willing to share, can you think of a time you realized that you communicated something poorly? And did you realize immediately, or did it take some time to have that sort of realization?
Yeah, I think there's probably a whole slew of examples of this. I've been part of organization changes before, which I didn't give enough thought to the impact to the individuals and kind of wrote off a cavalier email being that we're changing this, this, and this. And then afterwards kind of realizing like people's managers would change, people who might have been about to get promoted were worried that, oh, I'm hiring a different manager. Is that promotion going to happen? Yeah, that's one example of just being a little bit too quick on the gun with communications and not having that deep thought about the impact.
And then for the last question, so it seems like a bunch of people have asked about this, and you did touch on, how do you manage your direct reports and managing up, but any kind of last comments on, how do you approach communication across the different stakeholders? So you're managing up, you're already communicating up, you're communicating with your peers, and then you're communicating with your direct reports. So how do you just sort of approach that generally? Any kind of frameworks, any other tips, any last tips?
I mean, I think that the core principles are all still the same. Like, you want to be authentic, you want to be clear. It honestly, for me, it doesn't change that much, because it's all about the authenticity of the communication. I will prepare more for communication upward, because I always want to be much more well-framed when I'm giving feedback upwards to, my leader, a CEO who's busy running a company, and he doesn't need to hear, partially formed thoughts from me, right? He'd rather just get specific data. But other than that, I really think just the authenticity and frequency of communication, keeping that consistent is what's important. I don't tend to vary my style too much at the different levels.
Yep. Got it. Actually, maybe one last, this is actually an interesting question, maybe to end on, if that's okay with you, Asanka.
Yeah.
So Paul Mello is asking, how often do you have open discussions, and then how often do you use quote unquote pull rank, and just make a decision? So how do discussions, obviously you mentioned, you gave some tips on how to encourage people to brainstorm and be creative, but how often do you have to sometimes make a decision yourself as the leader?
I rarely have to do that. And the reason is I hate doing that, because I generally see that as an exceptional situation. Like, either something was so time pressing that I had, for whatever reason, I had to make that decision. But like, teams get behind decisions much easier if they were part of making that decision. Like, that's the reality. If you include them in it and they're part of it, they will support it and they will run with it much more so than when you have to make top down. But that said, as a leader, sometimes you do have to do that. I try and avoid it as much as possible and look for every opportunity I can have to include my teams in core decisions, until there is either no choice due to time, or just fundamentally I know that something is the right way to go and need to push the team in that direction.
Got it. So good leadership is, involving the team, I guess, in decisions, getting them to
Absolutely
discuss things. Yep. Great. And so first of all, I guess we're 30 minutes past the hour. So, Asanka, thank you so much for your wisdom, your advice, your perspective on things, for answering this lightning round of questions. And also want to thank everyone, for listening in. Thanks for watching, and we'll be hosting a lot more webinars this year and next year. So we'll keep you all posted. So again, Asanka, have an awesome rest of your day, and everyone else also have a great rest of your day.
It's great being here. Have a good day.